Good day to you all, and thank you for joining us. My name is Julie Renaud Evans, and I am a program director with the Northern Forest Center. The center is a regional organization that works across the Northern Forest region of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and New York. Our programs work at the intersection of forest stewardship, forest-based business development, and rural economic development to create thriving rural communities in the context of a healthy, resilient forest landscape. This webinar is part of our Building the New Future Forest series designed to amplify stories, practices, and lessons from community development, sustainable tourism, and forest economy in the Northern Forest. And I'll remind you that we are recording this webinar and it will be shared with all of you after. Today we will be discussing the new report, Beyond the Illusion of Preservation, with 3 of our 7 authors. The report calls for us to take a holistic and deliberate approach to sustainably meet our resource needs, while also safeguarding the ecological, economic, and social values of New England's forests. It addresses the imbalance of wood production and wood consumption in this region and encourages taking responsibility by protecting forests, reducing consumption, and expanding ecological forestry. Our guests will introduce themselves in a minute, but first let me give you a bit of their respective backgrounds. Dr. Tony D'Amato is a professor of silviculture and applied forest ecology and director of the forestry program at the University of Vermont. Prior to joining UVM in 2015, he was a faculty member for 7 years at the University of Vermont and a Bullard Fellow at Harvard University's Harvard Forest. His research focuses on long-term forest dynamics, disturbance effects on ecosystem structure and function, and silvicultural strategies for conferring adaptation potential within the context of global change. D'Amato received his BS in Forest Ecosystem Science from the University of Maine, MS in Forest Science from Oregon State University, and PhD in Forest Resources from the University of Massachusetts. Our second guest today is Paul Catanzaro. He is a professor in the Forest Ecology and Conservation Program at the University of Massachusetts. He also serves as the State Extension Forester, and he co-directs the Family Forest Research Center, a partnership between the USDA Forest Service and University of Massachusetts. Our third panelist today is Dr. Caitlin Littlefield. She is a senior scientist at Conservation Science Partners. She is a broadly trained research ecologist and works at the intersection of forest ecology, conservation biology, and climate adaptation science. She works with land managers and planners across the country, including federal agencies and numerous state agencies, to understand how forests and wildlife are responding to global change and jointly craft and deploy climate adaptation strategies. Prior to her current position, Caitlin taught in the UVM forestry program, conducted research at the University of Montana, received her PhD from the University of Washington, and a master's degree from UVM. Caitlin lives in Richmond, Vermont, where she has planted hundreds of trees along the Winooski River and serves as the town's tree warden. The order of business today is first we will begin with self-introductions and reflections by our panel. Then Dr. Littlefield will present on the report. Then we'll have a panel discussion with our 3 panelists, followed by questions from the audience. The best way to get your questions to us is to use the Q&A. We'll try to keep track of the questions that are coming in. We do have a large audience today, and we'll do our best to get to all the questions. So let's see. Tony, can you begin by starting with an introduction and your reflections on this work?
Sure, thanks, Julie. And I'll keep it brief so we can get to Caitlin in the main show. But yeah, thanks everybody for logging in. I'm Tony D'Amato here at the University of Vermont, and as Julie's introduction of my background shared, I've been really lucky to get to work across this region at different universities in different states. And so when I think about this report and how that intersects with my own life, I really reflect on my roots as someone that's born and raised in Franklin, Massachusetts. Those that know that part of the state of Massachusetts, it's not Franklin County, it's Franklin, Massachusetts. So about 40 minutes from Boston, and very much a suburban landscape. And so for me, I really benefited early on from having some forest land that was protected from the biggest threat in that area, which is conversion to non-forest. That allowed me as a young age to get out and have safe and equitable access to being in the woods and really experiencing that awe and wonder that I think all of us first experience and continue to experience when we get out there in those amazing ecosystems. And so for me, like many others, the connection to the forest and caring about the forest and all that it gives us was really what, led me to think that forestry was a career path I wanted to take. But ironically, where I was living, I was very disconnected from where a lot of the products I was using came from. And so it wasn't until I went to the University of Maine, living in that landscape, that I really got an understanding for just what large working landscapes look like and the real disconnect we often have from where our wood is produced and actually where most of the consumption occurs. And so I feel really fortunate both to be here at the University of Vermont and getting to work with many amazing young students that are really, I think, much more aware than I was in terms of just the global balance of our consumption, how it influences both societal dynamics as well as ecological conditions out in the forest, and really would be better prepared to understand this illusion that we're going to talk about today and some of the solutions than I certainly was when I walked in the door of a college or university many years ago. And so I feel really fortunate to have worked with Paul and Caitlin on this report, and certainly the other co-authors. And for me, a lot of why I'm excited about the message that it shares is that, that relationship that I certainly built with the forest early on in my life. And again, I recognize many of you have similar deep relationships with the forest. So much of that really is honoring what that forest provides us, both in terms of just the incredible aesthetic and spiritual and recreational opportunities, but also, those goods that we use on a daily basis at very high levels. And so the best way to me to honor those gifts is both to protect those lands, make sure we have areas that are forest forever and protected from conversion, but also that we are thoughtful and responsible about the wood that we are consuming, and ensuring that it's coming both from local sources as well as from forests that are being managed in ecologically and just way. And so I'm excited about the report and really do appreciate all the work that particularly Caitlin put into leading this.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks for being here. Paul, can you go next?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for taking time to hear today about the project we've been working on for, I guess it's been 2 or 3 years now. As Julie articulated, my focus with my work is primarily with family forest owners. So both as the state extension forester and as the co-director of the Family Forest Research Center, I really tried hard to develop an integrated research and extension program that helps learn about landowners, family forest owners, their decisions, their challenges, their goals, and help develop resources and strategies to help inform those decisions. So that's mainly where my focus lies in terms of my work. In terms of this project, over the last number of years, the focus on forest as a natural climate solution has really ramped up. Forests, I think, for the first time in at least my career, are getting a lot of attention, well-deserved attention, in terms of the benefits they provide, including these ecosystem services regarding carbon. But the conversations really seem to drill down almost exclusively on forests as a carbon and climate change solution, which is hugely important. But it felt like the conversations were missing an essential piece. And that essential piece is that we are voracious consumers of wood products, that wood products are a wonderful, environmentally sensitive product, but that we need to, in our approaches to the stewardship of our forests, be able to, excuse me, balance the many and sustain the many wonderful benefits that forests provide, not just carbon. So we need to think holistically, we need to think across the landscape, and we need to take into consideration the many benefits forests provide, and also the stewardship that will enable and sustain these many benefits within our forests. And so for me, this piece was really important, and we were, as I said, we were working on it for 2 or 3 years. And we kept saying to one another, we got to get this out. We got to get this out. We hope this helps this conversation regarding carbon and climate change. And so here it's out. I'm excited about it. I'm particularly excited about the opportunity to offer a balanced approach. I'm getting, frankly, just tired of the old debate of we should cut nothing, we should cut everything. And I hope that this vision offers at least one scenario, a plausible scenario of how we can and should have a balanced approach across the landscape. So I'm excited about that. And I'm really excited to sort of dive in, not to the extremes of do nothing or do everything, but to dive into that ecological forestry piece of how do we steward the matrix in between, and how does that knit everything together. So thanks for your time. I'm excited. I appreciate all the co-authors and all their work, and particularly Caitlin.
Thanks, Paul. That's excellent. We're so glad you're here. Caitlin?
Yes, thanks, Julie. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Really glad to have the opportunity to share this work that I've been lucky to work on with Tony and Paul and others for the past few years. So just to reflect a little bit on some of the questions that Julie posed for us, I'll share a bit about where I came from and where I am now, and what my relationship is to New England and our forests here. So I am, like Tony, like Paul, a lifelong New Englander, and left only for a sojourn to ski bum and attend grad school out west, but then came back here. Like Tony, I grew up in the suburbs of Boston in Andover, Massachusetts, and that really is where my first connection to trees and forests came to pass, even in our small little half-acre plot of woods behind the house I grew up in on our suburban cul-de-sac. And one of my favorite spots was this giant hemlock in that backyard, and I remember crawling under the boughs, especially when they were laden down with snow, and just lying there for what felt like hours. I'm sure it was only a few minutes in my little kid time frame. But I do think that single tree, that single backyard is where I first found those connections that really have launched me on a lifelong career of thinking about our forests and stewarding them. And I'm really glad in this context of the work that we're presenting today to help to clarify some of the consequences of what we think might be, or what maybe, to Paul's point, sort of these prevailing sentiments around a singular benefit that our forests and trees provide, carbon and climate benefits, and what happens when we focus solely on that at the expense of the innumerable other benefits that we derive from our forests and landscapes. And so that, to me, is really the most important part of the report that we'll be sharing today, is that there are unintended consequences and trade-offs associated with what are seemingly well-intended actions and philosophies that we just simply have to daylight. And that's really what we've tried to do in this report here, to clarify what some of those consequences are and the trade-offs are, and hopefully bring a more balanced approach to how we manage our landscape across New England.
Thanks.
So,
yeah.
yeah.
No, go ahead.
That's it.
Very good. Wonderful. Thank you for that introduction. And so we're going to transition now. I'll go off camera and Caitlin can tell you all about the report. Thanks, Caitlin.
Thank you, Julie. All right. Looks like this is showing. So I'll proceed right now, but Julie, Kendall, do let me know if there are any hiccups at all. So yeah, thanks again, folks, for being here, and many thanks to the Northern Forest Center, of course, for the opportunity to share this work with you all, and to set forth a possible vision for how we might keep New England's forests forested and safeguard their countless values, while also sustainably meeting our resource needs. So I'd like to take a second to give an explanation for what's a pretty provocative title here, and to really be clear about the legacy behind the work that we're talking about. So the illusion of preservation, that title, that's not new. We're talking about beyond the illusion of preservation today, but what we're building upon is this 20-year-old study that came out of Harvard Forest that set forth what you see in its subtitle: a global environmental argument for the local production of natural resources. And this argument in this report rested on a paradox that the authors laid bare, which was that, this was specific to Massachusetts at the time, that Massachusetts is rightfully proud of its abundant forests and history of conservation leadership. And yet, as a state, it produces almost none of the wood products consumed therein. And so, of course, preservation of more wild forests is crucial. But this original study argued, unless we also address the massive volumes of wood we consume, as Paul alluded to a minute ago, and how it's produced, namely importing it from elsewhere, where any negative environmental and social consequences can be ignored, then if we don't do that, then that preservation is an illusion. So instead, this study argued, we must simultaneously advance the preservation of intact wildlands while also conserving sustainably managed woodlands to establish a better balance between our production and consumption. So following this original publication, targets for that balance of wildlands and woodlands took shape, first for Massachusetts, then for New England, and then encompassing farmlands and communities too. And it's within this integrated framework here of wildlands and woodlands, it's within that framework that we've returned to the paradox set forth originally in this illusion of preservation. But we've expanded it now to all of New England, beyond just Massachusetts. And then one last point I want to make then is that in our own title, we're being very intentional in retaining the quotations around the illusion of preservation. And that's because we want to both honor the original work and give credit where credit's due, but we also recognize that this is a pretty sassy title. And we're not, in our work in this report, we're not looking to create more polarization or to cast dispersions on the thoughtful work of colleagues who are looking to protect more wild places. We need more big, vast wild places, as well as smaller, passively managed reserves peppered across the landscape. But what we're trying in this work to show is just how compatible and imperative it is that we protect both passive and actively managed lands to meet our wood product needs. So we need both wildlands and woodlands. So that's the caveat about the title of our work and the legacy that we're guided by. So if I had to sum up our motivation for revisiting this work, that original illusion of preservation, Paul really got at it a minute ago. It's really encapsulated in this. We're seeing mounting pressure to reduce harvesting, especially on our public lands, to maximize ecological values, and especially the capacity of our forests to store carbon. And though Southern New England is really in many ways the epicenter of these mounting pressures, they're of course starting to emerge further north too, in the northern reaches of our region. So against a backdrop of unprecedented climate change, it is in many ways really heartening to see this growing societal recognition of just how magical photosynthesis is and carbon fixation is. So rightfully so, people are looking to our forests as a crucial natural climate solution. And these are land-based pathways that keep carbon out of the atmosphere and are going to be key to helping us mitigate climate change as we also reduce fossil fuel consumption. And forests are right at the top in terms of being carbon powerhouses, not at all to disregard the importance of grasslands, wetlands, et cetera, but forests are really key here, not only in keeping carbon out of the atmosphere, but also in yielding in other important co-benefits like supporting biodiversity, supporting clean air, clean water, healthy soils. So keeping more carbon in our forests is key. However, a singular focus on maximizing carbon across the board can obscure any number of trade-offs. They might be ecological. And so although there are many species that benefit from mature and old forest conditions with lots of biomass and carbon, not to mention the countless ecosystem services that we derive from those sort of conditions, I'll share a few examples of natural communities here that provide important habitat to species, but in which more carbon is actually less. So here, thinking about our pitch pine forests in the Northeast, early successional northern hardwood systems, and further west towards the Great Lakes, oak savannas historically maintained by frequent fire. In each of these systems and others, more habitat conditions, more above ground carbon at the stand level, that's not necessarily compatible with restoring or maintaining habitat conditions that a range of taxa require. And in this figure that Tony compiled, we can see that for these example songbirds, the carbon stocking corresponding with optimal habitat conditions, they vary considerably. So if we focus only on maximizing carbon stocking rather than supporting a diversity of conditions, some of these species might lose out. A few other examples of potential trade-offs. In some contexts, higher carbon stocking levels might also contribute to density-dependent mortality, whether from moisture stress, insect invasion, or other factors. And in fact, some forest carbon project protocols might even incentivize such levels. So in this figure here, we're looking at the frequency of forest inventory and analysis plots maintained by the Forest Service, by hardwood and softwood, and by low and high site classes. And these are plots that either meet or exceed the basal area thresholds of a particular forest carbon protocol. Those are in orange, and those that don't meet the basal area thresholds in teal. And what we can see is that more carbon loss due to mortality in those stands that exceeds those thresholds, that's what's happening there when we have those thresholds established that aren't actually reflective of healthy ecological conditions. So once again, the push towards packing more in might inadvertently contribute to even more mortality. And briefly, just a few other examples. In some contexts, maximizing above ground carbon may lead to cumulative fuel loads that exacerbate fire severity. And something that we'll be discussing today, of course, the implications of reduced harvesting there might be implications for local workforces, tax revenue, and for leakage. And so bumping that production elsewhere, potentially to places where we have fewer protections in place ecologically and environmentally, and therefore exacerbating the illusion. So let's come back to our public lands for a second. These are where some of those potential trade-offs, ecological and economic, are frequently obscured as pressures mount to curtail harvesting, especially on state and federal lands, to maximize their carbon storage. From the moratorium on logging on Massachusetts state lands to ongoing debates centering on these lands and that photo on the right, Vermont's Worcester Range, pressure to curtail harvesting is mounting across the region. And we, the co-authors, collectively wholeheartedly support and agree in the value of passive management, and we support expanding wildlands, of course, especially as we tackle our climate and biodiversity crises. However, this strategy by itself will fail to provide the full suite of benefits that we seek from our forests here in New England and beyond. So if we reduce harvesting within New England while maintaining our enormously high levels of consumption, we're just shifting that wood production elsewhere, including to regions that might have weaker environmental oversight than we have the capacity for here in much of New England. And in addition, that leakage is going to do very little to reduce carbon dioxide in the global atmosphere. It simply extends the illusion. And so that is what revisited us. This new dynamic of these mounting pressures is what motivated us to revisit that original illusion of preservation. So we returned to this question there and expanded it again to New England from beyond just Massachusetts. Is New England producing as much wood as the region consumes? What about each state? So I'm going to briefly step through some of the data sets and methods that we use to answer this question, but not go into great detail. Happy to answer any of those during the Q&A. So we took a net balance approach to examine how our production compares to our consumption, and also how recovery fits in, how paper and wood products fits in, even though that's a pretty small piece of the equation. So to start with consumption, we drew our consumption estimates for lumber and for pulp from recent national per capita data from the U.S. Forest Service's Forest Products Laboratory. And we adjusted those numbers by the median household income in each state. As for fuel wood consumption, we set that equal to fuel wood production in each state because we could simply find no reliable data on the amount consumed within each state and within New England at large. Okay, so that's consumption. As for production, we explored various data sources, including state harvest reports, as, for example, maintained by Maine and Vermont. But all told, we ended up using forest inventory and analysis data from the Forest Service because that collection is standardized across states and recent inventories were available. So that's how we arrived at production. And then there's this one final and pretty modest piece, which is wood recovery. So we use published data on the volumes of wood recovered from construction and demolition, as well as municipal solid waste. And most of that we allocate to fuel, some to pulp, and a tiny little bit of what's recoverable into the lumber stream. And so across these three buckets, production, consumption, and recovery, we necessarily made a few simplifications and assumptions. So for example, we're assuming 2/3 of the average saw log in New England becomes lumber, and the remainder, the waste, gets allocated to pulp. We also simplified our analyses across hardwood and softwood. There are a number of other assumptions and simplifications we had to make. I won't go into them now, but again, happy to discuss during the Q&A period. Okay, so how are we doing then as a region? Oh yes, so we summed each of these items up to arrive at this net balance of each product class and our wood production, our wood balance total. So all told, New England produces about 3/4 of the wood products consumed within the region. And I'll step through this figure here. The height of these bars represents, the bar on the left is of course production, the bar on the right is consumption, and we're talking about volumes here for New England as a whole. But let's look at the components of each one. So I'll step through these. Components, consumption is parsed into lumber and paper raw materials. So that's pulpwood plus that sawmill waste. Production includes a tiny amount of recovery from the waste streams that I alluded to a minute ago, as well as pulpwood removals. We have saw log removals, and those are distributed into lumber and pulp to be used for paper. So we're not showing fuel wood in these charts and the subsequent ones I show because we've made that assumption that the volumes cancel out. So somebody might look at this number and say, it's pretty good. 3/4 is pretty darn good. But it's the disparities within the region and between New England states that I think are particularly striking and that show us that the illusion is operating within the region as well. So take a look at these numbers across the state. Collectively, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island produce well under 10% of the wood consumed in those states, despite being 60% forested. New Hampshire is closer to parity, and Vermont produces half again as much as the state consumes. Maine produces upwards of 325% of what the state consumes. And so what that means is that across the region, 70% of the production comes from Maine, and 70% of the consumption occurs in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. And of course, there are more people in those states. And in many ways, you can look at the heights of these bars, and they essentially are the consumption bars anyway, and they're on par with the state level populations. But we can do more. Again, these southernmost states are about 60% forested, and across the region as a whole, we have about 2 acres of forest for every New Englander, which is roughly the ratio of people to forest cover that the US as a whole has. And the US as a whole is pretty close to net balance when it comes to wood production and consumption. So we can step it up, we can do more. This imbalance doesn't need to persist. And we would contend in our report that it certainly doesn't need to be exacerbated by shunting our production elsewhere. So we can move beyond the illusion to produce a larger proportion of the wood products we consume here in New England. And we can do it well in ways to propel us towards our urgent biodiversity and climate change goals. But what will that take? What will it take for New England to move beyond the illusion and sustainably produce as much wood as we consume? And this is the question that we really try to tackle. And we'd like to suggest 3 steps towards doing so to be achieved by 2060. That is protecting forests, reducing consumption, and expanding ecological forestry. Okay, so our first step is to protect forests with at least 10% of New England's landscape in wildlands and 60% in woodlands. Why is this important? Protection is important because on average, we're losing about 30,000 acres of forest to permanent conversion each year. And that's a pretty worrying trend given the incredible rebound of the Regis forests in the late 19th and 20th centuries. This is a story you're likely familiar with. So after decimation of the region's indigenous populations, and that asterisk in the lower left-hand corner of the figure around the year 1600 is totally insufficient acknowledgement that the population of New England was not in fact 0 at the time of European settlement arrival. So that's our little caveat there. But after European arrival, settlers steadily cleared the forests of southern and central New England, while in the northernmost parts of the region, those were oriented towards more industrial extraction of timber and later pulp. So the abandonment of farmland in the mid-19th century allowed for the rebound of those southern forests into the last decades of the 20th century. And at that point, our forest cover started to wane again. And that ongoing decline is largely due to suburban sprawl, low-density development, and including that which really perforates the forest and compromises its ecological integrity and connectivity. So that middle image right there is not far up the road from me in Stowe, Vermont, where homes are crawling up the hillside. Another dynamic that's now coming into play of late is renewable energy development. A recent Audubon report found that about a quarter of all the natural land conversion in Massachusetts over a period of 5 years was due to solar development. And to be clear, we must deploy more renewable energy, but we really ought not be clearing our forests to do so. So if we don't substantially ramp up protections, forests will continue to be lost. And I do think that vulnerability is really lost on many people. So your average New Englander, I can look out my window right now and just see hillsides covered in trees. And yes, it's true, New England's about 80% forested at this point, but only a quarter of the landscape is protected, is formally protected from conversion to non-forest. So we need to urgently decrease the rate of forest loss, and we need to urgently accelerate the rate of forest protections. And so again, what we're calling for here is protecting at least 10% of New England's landscape and wildlands and 60% in woodlands. So step number 2, we're aiming for a 25% reduction in lumber by 2060. Given future housing and population projections, this is actually a really reasonable estimate of what's going to unfold. Housing starts and lumber consumption, as you might imagine, are really tightly correlated, and the region is actually projected to see a slowdown in population growth and housing starts by the middle of the century, and therefore, plausibly, a decline in lumber consumption. This might change if we have another pandemic, if we continue to see an influx of climate refugees in the region. But it's a solid, reasonable target, even as we meet our affordable housing needs. And we can do so with local wood. So for example, that photo in the lower left is a multifamily affordable passive housing building in Lewiston, Maine, constructed of local wood with support from local woodworks. We've got some room to improve with single family houses too. So a bit of trivia that just really blew my mind was seeing that in 1975, the average single family house in the Northeast was about 1,600 square feet. It's now nearly 2,800 square feet, even as families have gotten smaller. So reducing that footprint can mean a further reduction in material consumption. So we're also calling for a 25% reduction in paper consumption too. In the US, we consume about 4 times the global average of paper, and a reorienting of that lower grade material to more durable, innovative uses. So towards wood fiber insulation, towards mass timber, as in the beautiful building in the lower right, that's the design building at UMass. And that's because in many cases, wood is going to be preferable to other more carbon intensive materials, steel, concrete, plastics, polystyrene. So we absolutely envision the importance of wood substitution into these other materials. But across the board, wood, plastic, steel, concrete, polystyrene, we need to reduce that consumption across the board. So our argument for reducing wood consumption here is warranted for all types of consumption. We are awash in stuff. And so we absolutely ought to be substituting some of those materials with wood, but across the board, we really need to rein in our consumption. A lot of that stuff ends up in the landfill too, in the waste stream. And so as part of this step, we're calling for increasing a couple things here, the recycled content in paper to 50% and increasing our reclamation of wood too, from municipal solid waste and construction and demolition materials. So, and finally, our third step is to expand ecological forestry. And in a minute, I'll talk about just how much acreage that's going to require to meet our consumption needs into the future. So to draw directly from Tony's textbook here, a goal of ecological forestry is to sustain healthy, productive forests with native species diversity and a full array of ecosystem services by managing these forests in ways that bring them closer in structure, function, and composition to healthy natural forests at all stages of structural development. So we're harvesting wood products in ways that emulate natural patterns and dynamics while sustaining the full array of ecological values forests afford. And the focus here is on promoting natural forest conditions, large snags and downed wood, a diversity of tree species and sizes, canopy gaps and layers. And that's the focus rather than maximizing total yield in the short run. And so what that means is that ecological forestry might not produce as much harvestable wood as rapidly as intensive plantations or short rotation forestry, but it does produce a steady output of long-lived wood products that are often of high market value while protecting other forest values. And that's why we're seeking to expand ecological forest management. Even so, we do acknowledge that the expansion of ecological forestry may be challenging in some contexts. So for example, on corporate ownerships where high rates of return might be expected on shorter time horizons. Other sources of revenue, for example, from carbon markets might help. So in the photos on the right, for example, that's from the Appalachian Mountain Club's Maine Woods Initiative, where some carbon revenue is helping to support management focused on establishing higher stocking and restoring structural and compositional complexity. But all told, to expand ecological forestry to the degree we're calling for, we're likely going to need to see greater consumer willingness to pay premiums for such wood products. And that fits into the broader cultural shift around our relationship with forests that I'll return to. Okay, so to recap then, we're calling for these three things: protecting forests, reducing consumption, and expanding ecological forestry. So when we combine all those, we think about how those all fit in together, we need to arrive at this question here then: how much wood could ecological forestry in New England sustainably produce? And how much acreage will be needed for us to meet more of our wood product needs? So to answer that question in a way that's integrating those three items: protection, reduced consumption, and expanding ecological forestry, we've applied a broad conservative estimate that on average by 2060, ecological forestry could produce an average of 0.4 cords of wood per acre per year across the region. We're assuming 60% of that might be in saw logs and 40% of that is in lower market value wood. So that ratio is the inverse of what harvests across the region yield today. But with the expansion of ecological forestry and what that means in terms of a greater focus on more mature, higher grade wood, we do believe that this kind of ratio is achievable. So to meet our wood demands in 2060, that's 8 million cords. That's going to require 20 million acres of New England forest land under ecological forest management. And that's just under half of New England's land, or just about 2/3 of our forest. So where then does that 20 million acres come from? So you'll recall our goals of 10% of the landscape in wildlands and the remainder in woodlands. And so after we've withdrawn wildlands, we're allocating about 50% of our public lands in each of the states to be subject to ecological forest management, 50% of family forests and organizations and nonprofits, conservation organizations, and then close to about 100% of corporate lands in each of the states dedicated to this as well. And again, that's after we've withdrawn the 10% of New England's landscape into wild reserves. I do want to acknowledge that this is just one possible scenario for sustainably meeting our regional needs. So let's see how that shakes out in terms of our net balance model. So recall, we've reduced consumption. We have increased recycling and how much wood we're recovering. And what that means is that we're going to see a modest reduction in our production, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So here's what those numbers end up looking like. Maine is still a disproportionate producer for the region, but southern New England states are getting closer to producing about 20 to 25% of the wood consumed therein. And as a region, we're at a net balance. So let's compare this then to where we were. So what we're looking at now are the region-wide numbers for 2020 on those left bars, and then 2060 on the right-hand bars. And so that's production, those two left-hand bars, and consumption, the two right-hand bars. So again, our overall consumption has declined pretty dramatically. And accordingly, production has seen a modest decline across the region as a whole, which I realize might give folks some pause. But recall, we're reorienting production away from lower grade materials and towards higher grades. We're seeing more saw log removals. You can see that in that golden color in the left-hand bars of production. So we're seeing more saw log removals relative to pulp in 2060 than in 2020, which can represent increased stumpage values and might also help us to foster or reinvigorate the value-adding supply chains in the communities that are oriented around the forest industry. So that's easy, right? We can do that. Well, no, we recognize this is it's plausible, but it's an ambitious vision that's not going to be easy. We don't have a precise roadmap of how to get there, but we do have some inkling of what's going to be needed. So especially In the northern parts of our region, this is going to require some substantial near-term public investment in the workforces and infrastructure necessary to reinvigorate forest-based economies and reestablish low-grade markets. And much of this work is supported by folks like those at the Northern Forest Center. And so I'm really keen to continue exploring what these options can look like with folks like you all, Julie and Kendall. So this might go hand in hand, this sort of reinvigorating of forest-based economies with the growth of outdoor recreation economies in these parts of the region too. It's also going to require addressing some of those open questions surrounding the role of carbon markets, and especially how the growing enrollment of large parcels in carbon markets affects local economies and tax revenue, not to mention the potential for that leakage that I alluded to earlier. So the perpetuating the leakage and bumping that production, and therefore the exacerbating illusion, bumping that production elsewhere. So achieving this 2060 vision is also going to require a widespread embracing by the public of the key role that public lands play, whether it's state lands, federal lands, or community forests. And I think that these can serve really as a model for a balanced approach to both passive and active management. Both large and small, these tracts are key anchors in our protected area networks and have disproportionately high ecological and even social values. They can encompass big, vast wilderness areas and smaller reserves, along with active, sustainable management to meet our needs. These lands are subject to long-term planning, considerable oversight, and certainly public scrutiny, as we are certainly experiencing now. They can serve as training grounds for loggers and contractors who might then carry those good practices elsewhere. They serve as demonstration sites of ecological forestry to landowners, and as a place for the public to both explore wild areas and to better come to understand what sustainable active forest management looks like and where their wood products come from. And I think that's really key. That's part of the cultural shift that we really need to invigorate here. So then, and finally, achieving this 2060 vision is going to require a level of engagement of family forest owners on an unprecedented scale. So imagine this. These light green parcels those are the state conservation and conservation organization parcels in a little area of central Massachusetts, and the white outlines are private parcels. So after accounting for the withdrawal of wildlands as well, we're envisioning about 50% of family forest ownerships engaging in active ecological forestry. That's a lot. That is a lot more than what we're currently seeing. That's nearly 3 million cords of wood that we're envisioning from these lands, or about roughly about a third of the region's production. And that's on par with the victory gardens of World War II, when American families generated over 1/3 of the nation's produce in their own gardens. I love what Paul always talks about here, that we need that kind of scalement, we need of engagement, and we need victory woodlots. That's what we need across the region. And that's going to require a substantial cultural shift. So perhaps, especially for southern parts of the region, and that's maybe going to be the trickiest part of moving beyond the illusion of preservation, especially again in southern parts of the region. So to date, incentive programs have failed to engage a substantial portion of family forest owners in active forest management. But we're not, of course, starting from scratch. There are many examples of family forest owners who engage in excellent active management and who really seek to extend that stewardship and that relationship to the land with others as well, through important neighbor-to-neighbor, peer-to-peer knowledge sharing networks and programs. But still, I think that achieving this vision that we set forth is going to require an enormous cultural shift. And that's because I think in many ways, we've lost sight of a few key things related to our relationship with the land, with the forest, and with one another. So first, in many parts of the region, we've lost sight of our old age reliance on forests and on wood. It is all too easy to hop onto Amazon, order a set of teak patio furniture, and then turn around and balk at the sight of a tree being harvested. Hardly any households in the urban and suburban parts of our land or our region anymore are tending their own woodlots. And as we've lost sight of that reliance, any sort of logging or harvesting, whether carried out in the context of ecological forestry or not, has become anathema to many folks who would otherwise picture themselves as being locally oriented and environmentally driven. This is stoked by images of forest destruction on social media and by the fact that we've simply lost touch with the very materials that we rely upon, where they come from. So instead, though, imagine if we were to celebrate the production and use of local wood in the same way that we celebrate local agriculture. So that's one thing that we've lost sight of, our reliance on forests and wood products. And I think we've also lost sight of the complexity and interconnectedness of our world. And in some ways, that's a defense mechanism. Never before in the history of humanity have we had to grapple with these planetary scale crises like climate change and the looming trade-offs and unintended consequences of our actions and inactions. And that's scary. And I think in many ways, it can be much simpler and easier to just latch on to a simple solution. More carbon, we just need more carbon, or no more harvesting, don't need any more harvesting. But that kind of simplicity really obscures the complexity of our very interconnected world. And so the notion that no active management is the most actively sound approach we can take in our own backyards, well, that just bumps a potential problem elsewhere. And so when we couple that, of course, with the loss of 30,000 acres of forest each year across the region, we're only exacerbating the ecological and ethical costs in this very interconnected world, where natural resource consumption is simply a fact of life. So, and finally, and perhaps this is the toughest one to swallow, I think we've lost sight of the fact that there is indeed common ground among all of us who are engaged in the dialogue or debate around forest management, perhaps especially on our public lands. And our common ground is wanting this: thriving forested landscapes and communities long into the future. And I think the most assured way to achieve this, both across New England and beyond, is through that balanced approach that recognizes the complementarity and necessity of both wild places and managed places. We need passively managed wildlands and actively ecologically managed woodlands, and we desperately need to protect both. And so in the spirit of finding common ground, I'd like to end with quotes from two men whose views on how to manage our public forests are often cast as pretty radically opposed, when in fact, I don't think they're that much at odds, and they're really very consistent with the visions we set forth here. So Gifford Pinchot, the first chief of the Forest Service, on the right there, who focused on multiple use and the greatest good for the greatest number. And then on the left, John Muir, a founding father of our country's preservation movement. So Muir said, when we try to pick out anything by itself, forest carbon, for example, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. We cannot forget that interconnectedness. And Pinchot said, the vast possibilities of our great future will become realities only if we make ourselves responsible for those realities. So let us all commit to the possibility and responsibility of a future reality of New England's forests thriving across the landscape with the communities as well, long into our shared future. So thank you.
Caitlin? So we do have next discussion with the panelists, but I do want to start with one clarifying question that has come in. I don't want to make it wait till the end, which is this question. Can the authors clarify, is the report saying that New England produces a volume of wood equivalent to 76% of what we consume, or that literally 76% of the wood consumed in the region comes from the region?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that it's the first of those two. It's that we produce about 3/4 of the volume of wood consumed. It was just not tractable. And believe me, I spent so long looking for various data sources and trying to figure out ways of accounting for the flows of wood within in and out of the region. But that was simply not tractable. And so we have what we produce here, and then we have what we consume here. But we are not specifically tying that wood production to what's consumed within the region. That's a great question.
All right, so Caitlin, why don't you take down your slide? Paul and Tony, come on camera, and we'll have a little discussion here. So these questions are meant for any and all of you, and please interact with each other as you like. So the first question is, what surprised you most about the results you found in the analysis of the 2020 data regarding New England's wood production and consumption? Jump right in.
Well, I'll start from a Southern New England perspective. I was actually really surprised it was about 76%, or is the equivalent of 76%. So that was something, being down here in Massachusetts, where the original illusion was developed, and I think that original, using the methodology of the original illusion, was something like 5% when Caitlin and Brian Donahue unveiled, the number 76. I was actually quite surprised, quite taken back. But again, as Caitlin articulated, as you take the next step, okay, how does that play out across the region? It became very clear that there is this huge disparity, that Maine is carrying water for wood production for the region, and Southern New England is consuming a tremendous amount but not producing a lot. So that disparity, that original 76 was surprising to me.
Anyone
Yeah,
else?
I guess I had a similar reaction, and I think also looking at Northern New England, we all recognize just both by size, but also by just the long history, the importance of forest products industry in Maine, just the disproportionate share that they carry. In Vermont, we benefit a lot from a low denominator when it comes to looking at our consumption. Very rural state, but we have a lot of forested land in the state. Same with New Hampshire, and both certainly aren't producing at the level that Maine does, or even come close to it. And so I think, looking at that regional balance, just how important Maine is to carrying that, but also I think that that regional imbalance just shows that in many cases where most of the consumption is occurring, there's a real disconnect from where that comes from. Because I think most, when they talk even in discussions around the future of Massachusetts forests or Connecticut's forests, very rarely do they say, and we'll keep thanking Maine and other parts of the region for making us look almost close to 100%. So I think to Paul's point, I was surprised with how close we were, but also that regional inequity from state to state, I think, is really, to me, the one that we need to be certainly reflecting a bit upon as we have these kind of state level discussions and regional discussions about the future of the forest.
I'll chime in too. And this, I think what was most surprising for me was not the results per se, but more so how hard it was, and this relates to what I just said a minute ago, to find data about our wood flows within and beyond the region. And so that, I mentioned that we ended up relying on the Forest Service's Forest Inventory Analysis data set. That's because we just don't have standardized reporting across all the states as well. And so that's with regards to both our production and consumption and wood flows, but also in terms of how much acreage is, for example, currently under management by ecological forestry or otherwise. And so I think that, in many, that's been a question we've been asked, like how much wood, it's very logical given what we present here, how much acreage is currently managed by ecological forestry or managed at all. And we've always just had to say, we simply don't know, we simply can't say. And so I do think that a standardized region-wide effort to better tracking our what forest is actually under management and under ecological management, and where our wood is produced and where that flows to, would be really important baseline information as a means to hold ourselves accountable to advancing these goals that we envision here and elsewhere.
Right, thanks.
Julie, I just want to jump on that because I think that's such an important point. I think we all recognize the importance of forests. The most recent emphasis, of course, as Caitlin so wonderfully articulated, is on the climate change mitigation side, the carbon side. But as we know, there's a myriad of benefits. If in fact we do recognize the importance of forests, then we need to invest in them and support the industry and industries, plural, and organizations that support them. And that includes better data. That includes understanding what's happening out there, understanding what's happening with the industry, understanding how many acres are being stewarded or not stewarded, understanding the forest conversion, better than we do now. There are a growing number of wonderful remote sensing LiDAR technologies out there. If our forests, we should step up to the plate. If our forests are in fact as important as we say, then we need more investment in there. And I think that piece that Caitlin articulated about better understanding the trends and what's happening, it just seems completely logical to being able to move forward.
Thank you. All right. The farm to table analogy of local food production was mentioned in the report, and I think that this may be part of the required cultural shift you referenced, Caitlin. What will it take for people to embrace the same approach to regional wood production and use?
Well, I'll start off here. I'm curious to have Paul and Tony's thoughts as well. I do think that local agriculture is a really apt analogy here, but in many ways, it's also a tricky one because there's an immediacy to what we see and what we get with local agriculture. So we're used to, in many parts of the region, seeing rolling pastures and cornfields and thinking about them as really a lovely part of our pastoral landscapes. Many of those were in fact forests at one point, of course, too. But for many parts of New England, and especially perhaps the southern suburban areas, we don't have those comparable working forest lands. And so there's not that connection to what production looks like and the products that we get that result from that kind of production. And also related to that immediacy question too, there's a timing issue. And so within a single growing season on a farm, you can enjoy the fruits, the literal fruits of local agricultural production. But that's just not the case with growing wood. And so that's a much longer time frame. But I think that in many ways, that really long time frame, that extended time frame is actually where that arc is where the opportunity lies. Because there are still benefits that can be derived and seen and enjoyment that can come at all stages of that arc of forest management. So I'm thinking about helping folks get accustomed to what a working forest looks like. So perhaps especially after a harvest, the messy aftermath, and helping folks understand, well, this is important habitat for many different species as well. Here's opportunities for foraging, traditional medicinals as well. And then connecting folks with the very wood that's coming off of those places. And so I have a lot of faith in the importance of sort of social diffusion. And so what does it mean for every kid in a shop class to be participating in taking down a tree and then turning a bowl on a lathe in their shop class? And I know that's a silly little example, but it's that kind of little connection that I think then really can precipitate outwards. So it's whenever if your local town is looking to renovate the town center, insisting upon it being local wood. It's every time you're at Home Depot or whatnot, asking for where the local wood is, or connecting with groups like Local Woodworks in Maine that I alluded to, so that we are connecting to those. We're establishing just more of a culture of using local wood production. So I think it's got to take all of us to just be nudging everywhere with our friends and family, and then in our municipalities as well, to really enhance that uptake.
Thanks. Quick additions from Paul or Tony? Okay.
I would say that I start with I love when my ecological science colleagues start talking about social diffusion. It just puts a big grin on my face. I love that because you're 100% right, Caitlin. I love it. It's about connection. There's a stunning lack of connection, of just even knowing, where wood comes from, or and enough space to recognize that this is an environmentally sensitive product and to grow that appreciation for it. I've never met somebody that has used local wood that was mad that they use local wood. It's often the first thing they show you. Look at this flooring, or look at the trim, or we did this post and beam. And so I think it is social diffusion. That means it's slow. That means that it's person to person, and there's a ton of wonderful research on the importance of peer-to-peer. But I think it is about increasing that connection.
Thank you. Tony, I have a next question for you, which is some clarification on forestry concepts and terms. So the report discusses where the wood comes from, talks about the northern production zone, the southern greater consumption, etc. But there's also lots of forestry concepts brought up. Can you please distinguish between general forestry, how that's different from ecological forestry? And what is this comparison of active and passive management? And what are the changes we might need to see across the whole region to get to our vision of increased ecological forestry?
There's a lot of pieces there, and also a
Yeah.
lot of questions in the question section intersecting with this one. So I'll try my best to succinctly get at those. And so I guess, one of the questions, like when Caitlin shared the definition of ecological forestry, is that the only one? And is that what everybody uses? And so I'd argue that, there are many models of ecological forestry and kind of that ecological relationship with the forest long before any silviculture textbook was written. If you look at kind of how indigenous partners have interacted with the forest and that reciprocal relationship with the forest, for a long time, using an understanding of like how the ecosystem functions, how to best interact with that has been there. And so that's not the first definition, but it's certainly one that is used today. And I think as a contrast, with how we think about silviculture broadly and the way we go about managing, so much of our emphasis has been on sustaining the forest crop, really producing wood and managing forests in ways that are efficiently doing that. And so that certainly relies a lot on ecological principles, tree growth, silvics, soils. So there's certainly ecological elements in all of the forestry we do, but the emphasis really very much is on like focusing that part of the ecology towards fiber production, as opposed to maybe thinking about what might best support all the benefits and all of the different values one might have for an area. And so with ecological forestry and kind of the application of that ecological silviculture, you really are trying to use an understanding of just how forests operate and their dynamics, kind of the natural ecosystem, and use that to inform silvicultural approaches that really are trying to balance that need to produce wood, but also other environmental and social outcomes. And so really managing for more than just the timber crop, certainly as Caitlin was talking about, like thinking about the continuity and structure over time. So leaving trees behind to die versus, thinking of every tree as an option that's going to end up on a truck. Certainly trying to increase the heterogeneity of that ecosystem. So bringing back some of that complexity that really is a hallmark of many of our natural systems, as opposed to kind of the more uniform conditions we often manage for, as well as thinking about just the timing of how we go out there and do our interventions. Does it make sense to grow things for longer rotations, or maybe lengthen cutting cycles depending on the species and processes we're trying to manage for? And then certainly considering that across the landscape. And so that broader focus brings in kind of your question around active versus passive. Those have always been, I think, a core part of how we think about forest management. As Paul mentioned, it's a bit frustrating that it's like either you're for not managing forests or you're in the forestry camp and all you want to do is manage everywhere. We've always been talking about a balance, a need for areas that are wildlands and a need for areas that are woodlands, to kind of, I guess, riff on the Harvard forest kind of delineation there. And so, in those actively managed areas, we are using, engagement with the forest, certainly doing, harvesting, thinking about trying to steward those ecosystems for diverse goals, including kind of meeting our consumptive needs, as well as thinking about how to best steward them in a future that's quite uncertain. There's some questions about like, climate change, et cetera. So are there ways to actively engage and try to, really sustain those ecosystems going forward? On the flip side, we need these natural areas, both just for the ecological and cultural and aesthetic values they provide, but also those have always been, at least I've explained to me, as a really critical benchmark to compare to and understand, places that we're not managing, how are those changing relative to the ones that we are? And so to me, they're both important, but the key element for all of those is that they're protected from development, which is the thing we don't want to see happen out there. And so both need, our energy being devoted towards that. And so the final part of your question, which I think we're getting to, is how do we, what changes do we need across the region, to kind of keep, active forest management happening in ways that sustain forest products in the future? I think some of it is, as Paul loves when we talk about social science, a big piece of it is social, but and economic, and that people just consume wood and don't really think at all where it comes from. And to be honest, have not really shown a care to pay more money for like wood that comes from a highly, high environmental standard, a high social standard. People just go to the store and buy it and don't think, is this coming from a place that was displacing native populations and forests, or a place where they really aren't doing even like traditional silviculture. They're just kind of cutting wood and not thinking about it. So I think we need a shift in just consumer behavior to actually prioritize and emphasize those places where wood is coming from a high environmental standard, But I think also this idea that if we want to sustain forest in the future, we need to, be thinking adaptively, and managing, for those changes in ways that can help both deal with climate change, changing dynamics with insects and diseases, and ensuring that people understand the value of engaging with the forest to address those challenges versus just kind of saying, the forest will be fine on its own, which I think is a pretty naive assumption for a lot of our landscape.
Thank you, Tony. So we have a long list of questions waiting for us. I'm going to warn my panelists that I'm shifting on my questions, so you might get surprised. Paul, I'm going to ask you about the family landowners that you work with. You've mentioned them already a little bit, and we want them to play an increasing role in perhaps harvesting to provide wood for our needs. What are some of the barriers that you foresee in engaging more harvest-willing landowners in southern New England?
I think in part it's the outreach or the education of helping them to see the critical role they play within the landscape. That really our landscapes, right? They're a quilt of family forest owners in the matrix with these anchor points and of public lands and conservation organization lands. So seeing this critical role that they play and helping them to see that, helping them to see the opportunities or the strategies that they can implement to reach not only their own goals, but also those public goals that we're all striving to sustain, I think is huge. So the question is, how do you do that? And to me, the answer is local. In fact, I think it's hyper-local, and I think it builds off of the wonderful comments that Caitlin made a few minutes ago. I think it's about increasing relationships between landowners and increasing relationships between landowners and foresters. That there is a very important way that we know through our social science and experience that landowners make decisions, which is fellow landowners with experience that they trust are important sources of information. And it is oftentimes that type of relationship that moves somebody to action to achieve their goals. And so I think, I know this is probably wildly unpopular, but we're not going to cost share our way out of this. We're not going to, these government programs are hugely helpful for a very small number of people. But if we really want to reach not 10% or 5%, but 50% or even more to help achieve goals such as this or climate change mitigation, we need a new strategy that reaches a lot more people. And I think, for example, instead of investing the thousands of dollars we do in all of these management plans, we could be paying consulting foresters that same amount of money to build relationships with landowners locally. I think a consulting forester could reach 4, 5, 6, 7 times the amount of people. And when we do the research, we know that it's the relationship with the forester that makes the difference more than the management plan. So I think it's not necessarily even more money, but shifting the money to new strategies. I think there are a couple of excellent models. People are already out doing these kinds of things. I think Cold Hollow to Canada and their neighborhood approach is spot on. I think the Northland Area Land Management Cooperative, NELMAC, up in New Hampshire is spot on. I think there are lots of wonderful informal examples of landowners working together. That's the kind of investment we need to make at that local level in relationships. And I know it's not sexy, and I know it's not going to, cause change overnight, but that's that cultural shift that we're looking for. And that's frankly the only way to get there. We got to put the work in to build the foundation.
Great, thanks. And finally, Caitlin and Tony, do you briefly want to talk about the equal importance of continuing to source wood from our public lands in a couple minutes or less?
Yeah, I mean, it's really frustrating in many respects when we talk about being ecologically and socially, broadly environmentally responsible, and in actuality, the areas getting the most scrutiny for any cutting right now are public lands, where to be honest, they have the highest standard of any land in terms of both just ensuring that there's there's a lot of balance in what they're managing for and long-term planning and just an ability to produce wood that, I always just feel like very good about seeing, wood come from those lands. And so, so they play a very important role. And ironically, if we look at the volume harvested, like the state I work in, a lot, it's very small right now. 3% of Vermont's, wood comes from public land, which is makes me feel really good. 3% of that wood I know came from a place that had tremendous oversight and review and just things that we all should feel good about. And so I think it's a critical role. I think it should be growing. I'm not saying 100% of public land, but growing that and certainly maintaining the amount that comes from public land is so important, both for meeting kind of the intent of those lands, which is to serve the needs of our region and our nation, depending on the ownership, but also as a place to model, when you don't have like a 7% return on investment kind of pushing up against your bottom line, how can you actually manage still for, good forest habitat conditions, good long-term objectives, while also producing wood, and in a way that really is sustaining the mills and the loggers that are adjacent to those properties, just their importance for those those places, but also I think just being able to provide that model of good stewardship and opportunities that are a little bit harder sometimes to realize on a private ownership. So I just think it's a big part of what we're talking about, and it's a little bit unfortunate that some are trying to extinguish that as an option for ecologically sourced wood in our region.
I'd like to comment briefly too, and in addition to what Tony said there, I think there's a strong, a lot of where these debates are playing out and where pressures to curtail harvesting are playing out on our state and federal lands. And there is a key role for municipal and community forests too. And this, I think that in many ways, those places are in many ways where it gets back to that local comment that Paul was making, that's where folks are out in the woods, perhaps the most. And that's where there is a chance to have these demonstrations and this engagement with what active forest management can look like and what passive forest management can look like as well. But both Tony and I live here in Chittenden County in Vermont, and there are a number of community forests with excellent stewardship and countless opportunities for public engagement and signage up everywhere, webinars nonstop, QR codes on these signs so folks can understand what is going on in these forests and how the active management is not only yielding local wood to be used in various capacities, again, our local town center, for example, but also to help sustain habitat, how it can totally correspond and be complementary with recreational trails. And so I think that there's a really important piece for municipal lands as well to serve as a model for that balanced approach.
Right. Right, thank you all. I am going to shift to the questions. We have a lot of them. I'm going to do my best to pick those that are not something you've already said. So how might any expected increase in harvesting older trees intersect with the increased nationwide focus on managing for older forest conditions? Who wants to take that one?
Well, you can do both. I mean, I think that's, kind of the beauty of it, in that I'd say older versus larger, if we're really focusing in on like kind of it seems to me that the emphasis on old forest is being driven by carbon versus maybe these old trees have some unique ecological value. And so if you're looking at the carbon, like a big tree versus an old big tree, kind of similar pound for pound, literally. Benefit, although maybe the younger big tree might have less decay, but I won't get into the semantics of that. And so, we've for a long time, and many others, I really credit Craig Lorimer in Wisconsin, kind of the idea of using crop tree release to kind of accelerate large tree development, really in the name of restoring old conditions. And so you're cutting trees, and you're certainly doing management to push that structure forward. But I think they can go hand in hand. You also need areas that don't get managed, and particularly like true old forest, but also, maybe some areas where you're doing some initial treatments to kind of push them along that trajectory a little bit sooner. But I think one of the challenges is that, there's been this narrative set that, whether it's this new term, mature forest or old forest, if you just kind of magically wave your wand at an 80-year-old stand and say that's future old growth, it'll get there, without any intervention. I think there's actually some options to accelerate that process. And there's been a long, body of work. Certainly Manomet did a lot of work showing that a long time ago in Maine, kind of when we start getting some of those old forest conditions and ways to possibly accelerate that. So I think they can be compatible, but the key is, I think, that trust to understand that forester is not just thinking about cutting wood for the sake of cutting wood, but really doing it with these broader objectives in mind. And I think the caricature being painted today is often that's we're cutting wood because we like stumps and not trying to achieve other objectives with it. So I think they're very compatible, and I feel like there's a lot of outreach and science out there that points to that, if people allow active management in those places.
Thanks, Tony.
Julie, I want to build on that because I know that our focus and the decision making is at the stand-in property level, as it should be, right? I mean, that's generally where our focus is. But just imagine more of a landscape scale integration. Imagine knitting that together. Caitlin showed that wonderful map that had the 2 anchor points, those public forests, and then roughly 50% of the parcels lit up in a shade of green to sort of show that percentage of private ownership. Imagine if there was an application of ecological forestry across that landscape, that it's not just the passive that have this old forest structure, that all of those parcels implementing ecological forestry are looking at continuity, are looking at structure, are keeping some big trees per acre, no matter what intensity of silviculture they're doing. If everybody has their eye on that, and we have that structure across the landscape, then it's not just our passive places that give us old forests, it's that our landscapes are integrated in a way that complement each other and leverage each other. That even though we're getting multiple benefits, maybe even early successional habitat in one part of the landscape, they still have patch reserves that have this older condition at a smaller scale. And that added with their neighbor and their neighbor's neighbor and their neighbor's neighbor in a landscape of a reserve, all of a sudden, all of that adds up to something much bigger than what's happening at the property level. So I would encourage us to think in a more integrated approach across that landscape.
Yeah, let's consider that landscape level view a little bit more. We have a couple questions I'm going to put together. Did you at all look at production of wood in Quebec and that sort of inflow and outflow of selling wood products outside of New England? And then the related question is, how does the amount of forest per capita in New England or the US compare to the world? I suspect it's substantially higher. Given the interconnectedness of the world, doesn't that mean we have an obligation to produce more wood products in this region because of our ability to do so?
Yeah, those are great quick questions. Thanks for weaving them together, Julie. I'll first start with that question about Quebec and the wood flows to and from. No, we did not account for production there, but we do in many ways. We might conceive of our local woodshed though as inclusive of across that international border, because we are reliant in many ways on facilities there, especially as some of our infrastructure has been shuttered over the past few years. So that is an important component of our local wood economy, of course, but we did not track flows in and out of Quebec. Then to that question of given the of might we be obligated, perhaps ethically, to produce even more given consumption across the world? That's a great point. I think my first response to that though is we need to just consume less. And I think I mean, again, that statistic that I shared of the enormous amount of growth in just single family homes over my lifetime is insane. And we just have so much stuff now that I think we can certainly continue to foster a bioeconomy. And to the point of a couple other questions in there of supporting and fostering a bioeconomy that is centered in many ways on wood, while and substituting wood and innovative wood-based products for those more carbon-intensive materials. We can do so in a way that we also reduce our consumption. And so I don't have a great answer to that question of should we produce even more given the consumption across the globe, because I just think we've got to focus on ramping down our consumption period. What we're I want to be clear too that what we present here is it's just one scenario, and many other factors might mean that our consumption doesn't decline as much as what we're calling for, but I think we should be striving for that. And what we're calling for is also really already projected to occur given housing and population projections. If we also then shrink those single family houses down, if we also reduce the amount of consumption period across the board, we really can bring some of that under control, I think.
Right.
But there's also a production complement to that, right, Caitlin? In the sense that we need to get our own house in order, regionally before we look beyond that. Right now we're asking other people in other parts of the country and the world to shoulder the burden of what we're using for wood products, and that ain't right. And the wood we use should be an expression of our relationship and our ethic and our stewardship of our forest. And this is our chance to engage, create, evolve our relationship with the forest and produce what we need. And so to me, it starts there and the reduced consumption. Let's achieve that, and then we'll see.
Paul, I'm going to continue with you, I think, but you're all able to answer if you have the answer. What percent of Massachusetts is currently protected as wildlands, and how does this compare to the proposed 10%?
Ooh, I don't know this off the top of my head, but there was just a very detailed report, and I'll put that link in the chat when I can, about
Great.
wildlands across New England, which includes Massachusetts, of course. I can only tell you that it's much lower than that 10% goal. So I don't know the number off the top of my head, but I can give you the source that can tell you that.
And for all of you, what are some of the general thoughts about how we are planning to reduce wood demand? Awareness, education, things we've talked about. Anything else we've missed?
I think that's cultural too. And I think that, we saw this during the pandemic, the social isolation, the get people staying away from one another, the bigger houses, the bigger yards, the expansion of the distance from one another, really did not help in that direction. But I think as we start to recognize the importance of redevelopment of our already built places to protect more forest, of what it means to have the benefits of shared civic spaces and living more communally, honestly, I think that there are opportunities, especially grounded in our built environment and how we live and how we organize our communities, that will yield benefits we don't necessarily understand. Consumption, reduced consumption being one of them, but also greater connection with one another too. Where many of us are living very isolated lives at this point as we work from home and we live far from other people. And I think I'm seeing a trend, and certainly among even my peers too, towards living a little bit more communally, living within villages, living within towns, walkable towns. And I think that that's part of that kind of shift in the landscape and how our communities are laid out. I'm hopeful that that's entirely consistent with this potential reduction in demand, and consistent with the protection of our open landscapes right now. So that's my immediate response to that, Julie.
Yeah, and I might just add, we're obviously talking about wood products and the use of wood, because really that's the thesis of this analysis, and maybe the area that we feel most comfortable talking about. But I think just writ large, we don't as a society own our consumerism. We have very little acknowledgement for the impact of what we use, and it's unfortunate in particular, given the proliferation of, the technology we use, kind of all the advances we're seeing in green energy, et cetera, that really do require, minerals and other things that come from other places, that have impact. And so I think, the more we can be thoughtful about how much we use, how soon we jump to the iPhone 15.5 versus maybe like slugging along with the 15.25 for another, 6 months. All these things, I think we really are so disconnected in our region, whether we, feel it or not, like relative to other parts of the country, we are affluent enough to really separate ourselves in many cases from where things come from. And so that separation often allows us to consume in ways that we just don't think about, what the impact might be, or, what some of that, shirking of responsibility might be if we can actually produce that sustainably in our backyard. And so I think, with the wood piece, certainly I'm a huge proponent for all those places Caitlin's saying to live in, that we're substituting wood for other more carbon intensive materials. But at the same time, we need to be thoughtful about how we're doing that, because I think there's just a long history of us just using more than we need and not really thinking about it having some impact somewhere if it's not coming from our backyard.
We are running out of time. I'm going to give you a shot at one last question, so try not to take too long answering. We had multiple questions here. I know you can see them about Maine. So recognizing sort of the production in northern Maine that tends to be pulp, not sawlog focused. Recognize the political and economic difference in Maine from perhaps the rest of the region. And thirdly, questions about really large landowners in Maine and can they make the shift to ecological forestry. Any thoughts about Maine?
Well, I wish they'd advanced further in hockey. That's my first thought as an alum. But
Very
yeah,
good.
in terms of thinking about Maine, yeah, I think, Maine is in this report and just, I think, in our region, a unique entity, in terms of just how tied the region that state is, to its lands and to kind of forest-based economies. And at the same time, as we all recognize, has been, trying to find ways to sustain, a historically pulp-based economy with other innovations. And so I think in some cases, Maine, really is going to benefit from that shift, possibly to more local use of products that are good substitutes for more carbon intensive products as those markets evolve. But I also, think, the idea of ecological forestry and kind of Paul's comment on that, the landscape scale. I mean, there's certainly shades of what we call green. That there are some lands where maybe a large proportion still is focused, on trying to produce a fairly sustained flow of wood, but that there's elements of ecological forestry being integrated into those stands, whether it's now 10% or 15% is being retained in some way, shape, or form versus 100% being removed. But I think in many cases it goes back to that earlier comment I had, that people need to value where their wood comes from. And some surveys and evaluation of harvesting in parts of the region have shown that a lot of how our wood's being procured is not even fully classified as silviculture, and so, which I think none of us should feel comfortable with if we care about like long-term stewardship. And I think what that points to is a real challenge of being able to even make some of those less economically favorable investments and decisions that really in the long run can provide higher outputs and higher products that right now I think are challenged by either the nature of ownership structures or other aspects of the market. And so I think there needs to be both maybe a shift in kind of what people are willing to pay for in terms of those products, but also maybe a broader embrace of really trying to find ways to, Paul mentioned not a fan of cost share systems, but I think in some cases those ownerships that have been able to maybe shift to more ecological models are the ones that have been able to get other payments via carbon or other opportunities that kind of reduce that heavy tax on growth and rate of return that makes it hard sometimes to practice both silviculture but also ecological silviculture. So I think there's a need for many changes there. But Maine, is a huge part of this being accomplished, of course.
Okay. Thank you. And as I suspected, great conversation, lots to talk about. I apologize to those folks whose questions I did not get to, but our time has come to a close. Thank you all for joining us. Many thanks to the panelists for your good work and for sharing your thoughts today. We'd like to recognize the U.S. Forest Service for funding our webinar series. My colleague Kendall Gray will follow up with an email to all of you, which will include a recording of this webinar. Resources, we talked a lot about organizations and reports. We'll get those to you, and an opportunity to register for our next webinar. And for those of you who provided a mailing address during registration, you'll be receiving a paper copy of the report within the next several weeks. Our next webinar will be hosted by the Center's Outdoor Recreation Team on June 18th. We'll join the facilitators from the Northern Forest Outdoor Recreation Symposium, which is taking place next month, and they'll report on some of the outcomes that came from that gathering and perhaps some next steps to be considered. And on a final note, the center is hiring. We currently have 2 positions open. We are looking for an experienced professional with a passion for the forests and forest economy of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont and New York to join our team as the Director of Forest Programs. And we are also searching for someone to lead and support our center's cross-sector program delivery across multiple local communities and at the regional and state levels in Northern Vermont and New Hampshire especially. Please check our website for specific job descriptions. And with that, I will bid you a great afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.